Hi.
Hi.
And I am an adult child of an alcoholic. I am an addict, an alcoholic, and a codependent, also a recovering rescuer. But I put the emphasis on recovering. I had less than a year of sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was in graduate school in the summer of 1985, and there was another alcoholic there, a woman friend of mine, and we used to go to meetings together. This campus was on a mountain campus in the Green Mountains above Middlebury, Vermont, and we would, she had a car, and we'd go down to meetings in Middlebury. And one day she said, I'm going to an ACA meeting. You want to come? And I said, what's that? What's this ACA meeting? And she said, Adult Children of Alcoholics. Come on, you like it. So I came, and it was, there we were in a church basement in Middlebury, Vermont, in a room not unlike this, really, and about 25 people are in it, and there was a main speaker. And he told the following story. He said, when I was a kid, I was a Little League pitcher. And one year we made it to the playoffs. And it was my turn to pitch in the first game. And the first guy came up to bat, he bunted, and I ran in to field the ball. I fell on my butt and he was safe. Well, you know what? I pitched a no-hitter. But you know what my dad said? You screwed up. You could have had a perfect game.
Oh.
I related. I heard that, and I related. Because my dad was a perfectionist. Well, I was the third of 4 sons, and we turns out we were the perfect alcoholic family system. Alcoholic, codependent, or chief enabler, and 4 sons. We had the family hero, we had the scapegoat, the lost child, that was me, and the mascot. We were all there, we were all baby boomers. My father was a very interesting man. He was a good man. And I think he loved his children. I think he loved me. But in his way, he needed me to be perfect. But I had learning disabilities. I flunked the 1st grade. I flunked the 5th grade. I didn't graduate from high school till I was 19 and a half, right? And barely made it into college because of my learning disabilities. But there was more about what was going on there. His father was an alcoholic, and was an alcoholic during Prohibition. And when they had a lot of money. They lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, and my grandfather commuted to New York. He was an executive vice president for General Foods, and he was in line to become the next CEO of General Foods. He started the frozen food division of General Food, Birdseye. My grandfather did. And yet they passed over him because of his drinking. And his boss said to him, if I hear you drink one more time, I'm going to fire you. Well, sometime in the late, 1926, 27 or something like that, my father's older sister got married. And my grandfather toasted her with a glass of champagne. And my grandmother was so angry, she sent her youngest daughter to tell the boss. He got fired. He got fired. Well, that was just about the time that the stock market was crashing. My father, when he entered Harvard as a freshman in 1929, had the highest allowance in the freshman class. 4 years later, when he was in law school, his father told him, I can't afford your tuition. They'd lost everything. They had a house in Greenwich, Connecticut on Lake Avenue next to the Bushes. The Bushes, the presidential Bushes. And their father at that time was Prescott Bush, who was a United States Senator. And then, of course, George H.W. Bush became president, and then George W. Bush became president. Well, all of the servants in my grandfather's house went to work for the Bushes. And my grandfather and my grandmother separated, and he went to live in the Harvard Club in New York. And my father at that time was in law school. At this point, it was somewhere around 1933, 34, 35, something like that. And my father, during the summer, he was down in New York doing some law clerking for a law firm in New York, and his father sent for him. And he said, I want you to bring your mother here tomorrow, and I want you not to bring just in the lobby of the Harvard Club. I want you to bring her up to my room. And so my father dutifully did that, but something told him that something was wrong. So he brought his mother, my grandmother, left her in the lobby, went up to his father's room, and found him hanging from the window ledge, ready to tell his wife, if you don't take me back, I'm going to kill myself. So my father told me this story later, many, many years later. But so he pulls him in, and averted that crisis. Well, soon enough he ran out of money and couldn't afford to live at the Harvard Club anymore, and was living in some seedy hotel in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And then 1936, 37, sometime around in there, put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger, But he was very, very controlling. My grandfather was. And he left my father, his eldest son, a one-line note. Burnish the name that I have tarnished. And that was a curse. It was really a curse. So my father had some rich friends from Harvard and all that, and he borrowed the money from a rich friend and paid all of my grandfather's debts, paid them back. And then he spent the next 40 or 50 years paying all that back himself. He did it. And he kept that one-line note in a green lacquered box on top of his dresser. I have that box. And when my father turned 90, we had a big party, and each of us and many others gave toasts. And in my toast, I said to him, Dad, you have burnished the name that your father had tarnished, and I think you can get rid of that note. And 3 years later, when he died, we looked in the box and it was gone. It was kind of interesting. But my father was very, very disciplined. And after his family lost all that money, he kind of got that depression mentality and became kind of a miser. But also, he went into the Navy. He had been on they didn't have the ROTC back in those days. They had something called the Holloway Plan. And he stayed on the Holloway Plan. And so after he got out of law school, eventually he went into the Navy. He was on active duty in 1939, so he was on active duty when the Pearl Harbor attack happened, which was a couple of months after he married my mother in 1941. And then the four of us were subsequently born, in that decade. But so he had, he grew up very wealthy with an alcoholic father who was very, very controlling. He became very, very controlling. And eventually, he was a naval officer during World War II, became a lieutenant commander, was on Admiral Nimitz's staff in Guam at the end of the war as a junior officer. He stayed in the Naval Reserves after the war, made captain, and eventually made admiral. And so, now, and this was a great source of pride for him, and so we called him the Admiral. And we can tell you that the Admiral ran a taut ship. He really didn't, and then he could be really, really strict at times. So when we were just little kids, we'd get every Saturday morning, we had to be ready for inspection. And we had to clean our rooms and then we'd stand at attention. He'd come and inspect our rooms, and then we'd go in and line up in front of his dresser, and he'd give us each our allowances. And that happened, for a few years. But also, it's, he had a rule, and that was, don't be rude. And so if you said something to him that challenged him, he would just, don't be rude. In other words, don't question my authority. Now, don't embarrass me or challenge my self-esteem is really what he was saying. As he was an adult child of an alcoholic, and also a drinker himself, but he was so disciplined that he wouldn't allow himself more than 2 drinks during the week. When he came home at night after work, we lived in Westchester County, New York, and he took the train in every day to his job, and eventually he went to work for Merrill Lynch, and he founded the Real Estate Investment Trust Division of Merrill Lynch back in the 60s or 70s, somewhere around in there. And so he did become successful himself, and he did pay back all those debts. But he was very, very controlling, and he would, when he was having his breakfast and we were home on vacation or something like that, he'd write lists of things for us to do during the day, like clean the cellar or clean the gutters or do something like that, rake the leaves, which we would do because we didn't want to do it with him. He had the unmistakable or the incredible ability to make the easiest task into the worst drudgery. It was just, oh my God, he was so controlling. And so, but also the Admiral didn't take no for an answer. I never asked him to use the car. I always asked my mom. But I grew up as the third child. My oldest brother was really the family hero, and Dad wanted him to follow in his footsteps, so he sent him to the same prep school, Groton, which my brother hated, and then to Harvard. And my brother went to Harvard on a Navy ROTC scholarship, advanced placement. He'd been a National Merit Scholarship finalist, and was bright enough and had done enough work in prep school to skip freshman year. He proceeded to flunk out. Not once but twice, because it wasn't him. That's what my father wanted. He wanted him to be his legacy. But Peter said, and flunked out and then retreated to Vermont where he became a ski bum. But eventually went back and finished his degree at the University of Vermont and got a graduate degree there as well. But it was a dark day when Peter flunked out of Harvard for the second time. I was at home. We were just stayed away from the Admiral, But that was a dark day. But the funny thing is that after my father died, we had a memorial service and then a reception afterwards, and his godson came up and he said, "I really appreciated your father coming to my graduation at Harvard in his full dress admiral's uniform and giving me my commission," because he had, his godson had succeeded in going through Harvard with a Navy ROTC scholarship, and he had his godfather, my father. We were just bowing to him, because somebody was there, to fulfill that kind of legacy from my father. But so there were 4 of us, and my oldest brother, he was the hero until he flunked out of Harvard. Second brother was the scapegoat, and he would act out and act out and act out. And I saw him getting punished and getting spanked, and I didn't want any part of that. And I just kept my head down out of the line of fire, right? And it just, and I became the lost child. And my youngest brother has a tremendous sense of humor to this day. And he, would make everybody laugh. Age 4 or 5, he was calling my mother's friends by their first name. Everybody thought that was cute, that kind of thing. But I wasn't getting my needs met as a child. And, my father, after he retired, I think he really did become an alcoholic and, let go and said, well, I don't need to control this anymore. I can do whatever I want, and did. But by that time, we were all left. But growing up, I was very afraid of my father. And also, when my grades came in and he called me into the den, we had to look at my grades. They were horrible because I had these learning disabilities. At age 11, they sent me off to this remedial school, this boarding school. It was horrible. I found out really firsthand what homesickness is. 11 years old in boarding school is a little too young for that. But, my mother was always there. And at this boarding school, they had this little thing called the Board of Education, which was actually a paddle, and they would paddle us. And when my mother found out that they had this, they didn't talk about this when we were talking about admission, she forbade them to do it. And so they didn't do it. So all my buddies were getting spanked. I was doing the same things, but I wasn't getting punished for that. So imagine the guilt, that came along with that. Well, Mother's Day came along, and Mother's Day weekend, and we could take weekends. And so I had planned a weekend, and I had 2 roommates, and they had planned weekends. But we managed to wake up too early on Saturday morning and woke up the dean, his apartment was nearby, and he came in and canceled all our weekends. Well, the other 2 guys were allowed to get the paddle because their parents wanted them to come home for some Mother's Day functions or something like that. So I called up my mom and said, can I get the paddle so I can come home? And she said, you wait right there. And she came down and she went into that dean's that dean's apartment, and said, who the hell do you think you are? And she just let him have it. He said, I'm taking my son out of here, and don't you dare try to stop me. So there was that side of things too. Mom was there. She was there for us. So growing up, I didn't do well in school. And but after that boarding school, they sent me and my younger brother to a local grammar school, which was much better. And they saw what was going on with me, and they really helped me. And it was smaller classes and so forth, and I started to excel. But also in there, they had organized sports. And so my saving grace really was I was a good athlete. And all of a sudden I was a starter on the football team, and I was playing hockey and baseball and doing all those things. And so I had a lot of friends because I was a good athlete, but I wasn't a very good student. Still wasn't a good student. Then went on to boarding school after that because that's what we did in our families. We went to boarding school. And I did okay in there. But growing up, in order to get my mother's attention, what I would do is, because I didn't know how else, I didn't know to say, Mom, I need your love. I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how to say that. So when I was 2.5, I remember doing this. I took these 2 fingers and stuck them in a lawnmower. And I lost the tip of this finger. Right? And my mother rushed me to the emergency room, and they did surgery on me, but she was holding my other hand and telling me what a brave boy I was. Well, that was pretty cool. I mean, I can handle the physical pain. It's the emotional pain that's very, very difficult. Well, that started a pattern. 6 months later, on my 3rd birthday, I got a new tricycle. I rode it straight down the basement stairs, back to the emergency room. Once a year, I would do something. I remember sticking my barefoot into the spokes of my bicycle, back to the emergency room. They got to know me pretty well at the emergency room. So that happened till I was like 10 or 11 or 12 years old. Once a year, I'd go to the emergency room. And, but it was really, how do I get love? Because deep down inside, I don't believe I'm lovable. And it wasn't until I got sober and divorced at the same time that I started figuring this stuff out and going to ACA meetings, but also going to Codependency meetings and getting a lot of therapy. And what I learned was amazing. But it was still, so I was in countless relationships. I've been married and divorced 4 times. Okay? And it's always, love me. Don't get too close. Because if you see what I'm really like, you're going to reject me. So I'm going to pretend I'm somebody else, right? So I wear a mask. So for years I had a cigarette in my hand because I thought I was cool because I smoked. I don't know what anybody else thought, but I thought so. And it gave me kind of the courage to be that. And I was an athlete and so forth, so I had girlfriends and so forth, but it never amounted to anything because I didn't know how to love, because I couldn't love myself. I couldn't love myself. So love me, love me, love me. Don't get too close. Because if you see what I'm really like, because I believe that, then you're going to reject me. Because I didn't get the love that I needed in the family that I grew up in. So when I got sober and divorced back in 1984, it was in Carpinteria. I was a teacher at the Kate School. At some point, I overcame my learning disabilities and did okay in college and eventually went to graduate school. I also spent some time in the Peace Corps. I was not a very good Peace Corps volunteer. I was very too busy drinking, for one thing, but also looking for love. And I found love in a young college student who I got the Peace Corps to pay to tutor me in Korean. And eventually, very quickly, the tutoring lessons didn't last, and we had an affair, and eventually got married, which was a big mistake. It was a huge mistake. That's a whole other volume, but never mind. Eventually, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but my intelligence came through when I was in college, and then was able to go to graduate school after the Peace Corps. And I went to seminary for 3 years in Berkeley. I learned a lot there, and while I was there, I got divorced from my Korean wife and began seeing a therapist. And the therapist started really showing me what was going on, but I was still drinking, and so I could only get so far with it, And then while I was there, I met somebody else, and she was another alcoholic. She was from Montana, and she was in another seminary. But we got married, and it seemed like a good deal. We both liked the way we drank, and there was no criticism around that. And we were together for 9 years. And after seminary, we moved back east, back to my hometown, to that same school that I'd went to after that little boarding school. And I was a teacher there. And then eventually we went up into Connecticut and taught in prep schools there. And one year, about 1981, my wife says, I'm an alcoholic, I need to start going to meetings. I go, yeah. So, but I kept drinking. And she started going to meetings, but she didn't work a program. She didn't work the steps. And she became a dry drunk, and I was a wet one, and that's not a good combination in your marriage. Not a good combination. So in 1984, we moved out here to Kate School in 1983, and it was a horrible year. I mean, she was not happy. I was not happy. I was drinking and so forth. The marriage was really in trouble. And the summer of 1984, we drove back east, and she and her daughter house sat for some friends of ours at the school we used to teach at. Well, I was in summer school up in Vermont at the graduate school of English, at the Breadloaf School of English. And while she was there, she started going to meetings back in Connecticut that she'd been to before. And she reconnected with a guy she'd had an affair with, which I had no idea about, absolutely no idea about. So she picked me up at the end of the summer, and she said, I just said goodbye to a man I love. And I had no idea that this was going on. None. So, I freaked out, and we drove back across the country, sort of dividing up furniture and crying. Literally, it was sort of an odyssey of tears going back across the country. And some miracles happened on the way, which I don't think we have time for. How much time do we have? What? Oh, really? Okay. So So some very interesting stuff happened. One, we had planned to go north of the Great Lakes through Sault Ste. Marie and then on into Michigan and on through Wisconsin and Minnesota on Route 94 because we were going to go to Seattle to visit my brother. And we would also stop in Montana where she was from. So when we got to Ottawa, the day after she said that she just said goodbye to a man she loved, for some reason, and I didn't understand it at the time, and it wasn't until a few years ago that I really understood it, I turned south. Instead of going west through Sault Ste. Marie, I turned south and went down past Toronto and into Detroit, and then around through Chicago. And so we got on Route 90 instead of Route 94, which took us through South Dakota instead of North Dakota. And in South, we had decided not to see any of our friends along the way. We're driving through South Dakota, and she says, let's call up Hal. Well, Hal had been a Jesuit seminary, a friend of ours when we were in Berkeley. Berkeley has the Graduate Theological Union, which has 7 or 8 different seminaries. One of them was a Jesuit seminary. And Hal was a friend of ours. So we called him up, and he was a priest now, a Jesuit priest, on the Rosebud Indian Reservation. We called him up, and he came up and met us in this one-horse town in the middle of August. It was 120 in the shade. And in this greasy spoon, Hal told his story. Hal was an alcoholic. And I listened. And I was, oh, my God, I was identifying left, right, and center. So we get back in the car, and we're driving. He said, Susan, I think I'm an alcoholic. She goes, no shit. But it wasn't until a few years ago that it dawned on me that maybe something spiritual had happened back there in Ottawa that told me to turn south. Because if we hadn't gone south, we would have gone north, and we never would have called up Hal. And so a few days later, we got to Missoula, Montana, where Susan's brother lived. And so I left her with him, and I drove to a motel, and I called up my mentor, whose name was John. And John had been a teacher and 15, 20 years older than I. And John had been in Alcoholics Anonymous for about a year at that point. I remember teaching him how to smoke dope. He taught me how to get sober. So I called him. I said, John, I think I'm an alcoholic. He goes, I know. I said, why does everybody know but me? So he said, when you get to Seattle, go to a meeting and stand up as a newcomer. And I did that. But I'm an ACA alcoholic. Okay, and so that it has a lot to do with my self-esteem, how I feel about myself. So basically, when I got back to Carpinteria, it was just like, I really didn't know who I was, because I had identified myself as her husband, and she was now leaving me. And I didn't know who I was. And so, that's one of the symptoms that we read about, right? We don't know, we find out who we really are. I didn't know who I was. Well, thank God I had Alcoholics Anonymous, because I started going to a meeting a day, because that's the only place I felt comfortable. I wasn't comfortable at school. Everybody knew that we were getting divorced, and I was living off campus, and and they were just giving me a really wide berth. They liked me better when I was drinking, And I felt like a fish in a tree. It was horrible, And in the middle of the year, I remember going in to see the headmaster talk about next year, and he said, "Well, I think it'd be better for you and for the school if you went somewhere else next year." Whereas the head of the English department wanted me back, but the headmaster was a heavy drinker himself, and he was threatened by my recovery. So, but it was a good thing. It was a good thing. So that following summer is the summer that I went to my first ACA meeting in Middlebury. And so I started looking at this stuff. I thought I came from the all-American family. My father went to Harvard, He was an admiral. He was a lawyer, it was... No. And so it was crazy. So And I remember having been sober for about 5 days, still in the graduate school in the mountains, and they're having a dance at the end of the summer, and I hadn't had a drink in 5 days. I didn't have the nerve to ask somebody to dance. But if I'd been drinking, no problem, right? But I didn't have this because I was so afraid of rejection, right? So when I got back to Santa Barbara a couple of years later, they used to have these dances down at the Ilana Club on Friday night, and so I'd go down to the Ilana Club and practice getting rejected. So I'd ask somebody to dance, and if she said no, then it was not because she's rejecting me as a person. She just doesn't want to dance with me right at this moment. It's a saying no to the request and not to me as a person. See, I hear no, and it's not just the request. You wouldn't touch me with a 10-foot pole if I was the last person on earth. It's that kind of thing. So, but I began a lot of work. And working the steps in Alcoholics Anonymous, but also I began seeing a Jungian analyst, and I had aspirations of being a Jungian analyst myself. And eventually, over the years, I had almost 200 hours of Jungian analysis, and it helped. Believe me, it helped. But when I was the last pattern of that injuring myself in order to get my mother's attention happened when a week before I was 19 years old. And I was a senior in prep school. I was a prefect, and I was starting running back on the football team. And in that fall, it was 1966, we seniors were required to write a 5,000-word term paper in history in the fall and then English in the spring. And my topic was Harry Truman. Well, I was busy being a prefect, and I was busy with the football team and doing other things, and I hadn't done the research. And I hadn't done enough reading about Harry Truman. And the paper was due the Wednesday after we got back from Thanksgiving break. And so I went home, and I said, okay, what I'll do is I'll write during the day, and then I'll go out and party with my friends at night. And I did that for the first few days. And then on Saturday after Thanksgiving, we were celebrating my older brother's 21st birthday. And we had all kinds of people come to the house from, everywhere. There was a lot of drinking. And well, that Saturday morning, I was writing, and I had about 2,600 words about Harry Truman. I didn't have another word to say about Harry Truman. And because I hadn't done enough reading, I hadn't done enough of the research, and so I bagged it. I just said, the hell with it. Well, I didn't really know what I was going to do, and so I did nothing. And but also, I'd had a very special relationship that summer before. We had a wonderful time, and then she went off to her school, and I went off to mine. And for her, it was just kind of a summer fling. For me, it was the love of my life. And it was just, but she didn't have time to see me over that Thanksgiving break. And that hurt, So there I was. I was supposed to get the paper to the typist the next day so she could type it. We didn't have word processing back then. And then, so I could turn it in the following Wednesday when it was due. And, I only had 2,600 words, and I just bagged it. I just said, I denied it. I did, and so about 4:00 in the afternoon, my older brother and I started drinking. And part of one of my tasks was to go pick up several girls our age in town and, bring them to the party, which I did. And one of them was an old friend of mine, almost a sister, really. We had grown up together. And she'd been sick, and she'd had some sort of surgery, I can't remember. So along about 10 o'clock at night, the party was raging. She said, I'm not feeling very well, will you take me home? Well, she lived about 8 miles away on a road not unlike Foothill, which went through a town, so it was very windy. So I thought, we jumped in the family station wagon. I'd been drinking since 4 o'clock, right? We jumped in the family station wagon, and I drove her home. And on the way back, about a mile before getting home, I blacked out. I passed out, really. And don't remember what happened, but apparently what happened is 360, hit a tree, a signpost, and a stone wall coming around the corner. The steering wheel was forced back through the seat of the car. I wasn't wearing the seatbelt, and I wasn't there when that happened. I was underneath the dashboard. And there were 17 stitches taken in the side of my face. One of them was in my eyelid. There's no damage to my eye. And the only other injury I had was an overlapping fracture to my right femur. Well, my plan was to get into a small college and play football. And they told me I was good enough to do that. Well, I spent the next 4 months in bed with a broken femur, and they didn't have the surgery that they do now perfected. So they put me in traction. And so it was overlapping fractures kind of like this. And so what they do is they pull back, but it usually heals about like this. And it was on an angle. And so when all was said and done, my right leg was 1 3/8 inches shorter than my left. And, well, no more football. It kind of forced me to do something else. Well, eventually I got into college, and, I took my SATs that year on my back in a semi-body cast, after I got out of traction. And, I didn't get into any of the colleges that I applied to. My grades weren't that good to begin with but I was able to finish my senior year doing the winter term in the infirmary, and they had a squawk box that a guy that was in all my classes and he turned it on, and I went to class via the squawk box. I remember getting kicked out of class when the teacher turned off. But anyway, and eventually I did rewrite that term paper. I'm the only person I know in history that ever got an extension. So I got the extension on my term paper, and also the Monday after I was in the hospital, she came to see me in the hospital before going back to school. But I paid a hell of a price for that. So I got the extension, and she came to see me. But that was the pattern. If I injured myself, I could get the love, that I needed. She was there for about 10 minutes at the most. So that was the pattern. So when I got sober in 1984 and divorced, which is not a fun thing to do, believe me, and we've been together for 9 years, I didn't know who I was. I really didn't know who I was. But I began learning about adult children of alcoholics and learning about codependency. And I did a lot of work in that and a lot of research. And now I teach it, And I eventually became a licensed marriage and family therapist myself, But basically, what qualifies me, as a marriage and family therapist is not my degree, but my experience, believe me. That was the teacher, was the experience. And so, but also, when I left seminary in 1977, I knew all about God. I had a degree to prove it. Master of Divinity. That's what it says. It says Master of Divinity. Gordy, the Divine Master. What a crock. What a crock. But also, because that was getting into the heaviest stages of my drinking, I didn't need God. I knew all about God, right? I had the degree to prove it. So I didn't pray or I didn't cry except on one occasion. And in 1981, my 8-year-old niece was killed in a fire in Vermont. And everybody was crying and everybody was praying. And, my brother asked me to say the graveside prayers, and I did. And that was kind of an oasis in the middle of that 7-year desert that I was going through. And it wasn't until my own addictions, and I say addictions because it wasn't just alcohol, it was my codependency, as much as anything else, brought me to my knees in 1984. That the spirituality that I'd known before was right there waiting for me. So like the diseases themselves that are progressive, so is spirituality. The spirituality was right there waiting for me. So it's changed. I don't have the same kind of faith I had when I went to seminary. It's changed because in recovery, spirituality becomes practical. So when I was in seminary, they taught me how to think theologically. It was much more intellectual. But when I, came crawling into Alcoholics Anonymous, spirituality became very practical. I needed it for my own survival. And it was there, waiting for me. So these are things I still struggle with, So I became a therapist because I'm a rescuer. I have to admit that, right? But I found out fairly quickly that doesn't work. It really doesn't work. That we therapists tend to facilitate rather than rescue. And so I teach that now. And I'm fortunate enough to be the chair of the Addictive Disorders Counseling Department at Santa Barbara City College. And I get to train counselors and for state certification. And it's a wonderful place for me because I get to teach what I need to learn. And I teach this stuff. And I do, I have the Family Mobile, which was developed by my mentor here in Santa Barbara, Stan Rowett. And he took the idea of the mobile as a family system from Virginia Satir, the great psychologist from Stanford. And then Sharon Wegscheider Cruz came up with the roles in her book, Another Chance. And she has the role of all the roles: the alcoholic, the chief enabler, the family hero, the scapegoat, the lost child, and the mascot. She has a chapter on each one of them. Fascinating stuff. It really is great stuff. And I get to teach this. But in teaching it, I get reminded of it. And so much of what I've told you tonight is a lot of what I do in my lecture when I do the Family Mobile. And it's just, it seems so logical and it seems so together. But I remember, learning about all this stuff and then going home for my mother's 75th birthday, and falling right back into my old role, and there I am cleaning out the fireplace because my dad told me to, This is the same kind of stuff. It just didn't, but, and I never really felt my father's approval until after he and my mother moved into assisted living outside of Boston. And my mother had Parkinson's disease for the last 25 years of her life, which is a horrible disease. Really is a horrible disease. But one of the symptoms is paranoia. And she was convinced that my father was having an affair with a lady down the hall. So my father calls me up in Santa Barbara and says, I need your help. I can't tell you what that did for me, to have the Admiral call me and ask me for my help. So he flew me back east, and I spent a few days with him. I actually did couples counseling with my parents. And, it was successful. It turns out, but, and I also went and talked to her psychiatrist. They had a medical group thing. And, the neurologist who was treating her Parkinson's disease hadn't spoken to the psychiatrist. Here she is having symptoms of, severe paranoia. So I went and talked to the psychiatrist, and he prescribed some Zoloft. It worked, But you get these, whatever they are, the medical things, and they don't talk to each other, And so I just facilitated that, and that worked. So I'm very, very lucky. I'm very, very fortunate to live in Santa Barbara, own my own home, and to do what I love, And I'm still a slow reader for my learning disabilities, and my handwriting is barely legible. I'm left-handed. It's these two fingers I stuck in the lawnmower. But, all of that, I look back at it now, and if I hadn't gone through what I went through the couple of years after I got sober, I wouldn't be here right now. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I wouldn't be a licensed therapist. I wouldn't be teaching at City College. I'd probably be dead. But because, when I first got sober, I stayed sober because in the hope that she would see me sober and come back. She didn't. But, I remember an old timer at an AA meeting pulling me aside and said, look, if you're here to get your wife back, you're in the wrong place. But if you're here to do something about your drinking or how you live your life, then stick around. I began to hear that, and then I heard a woman at a meeting say, oh, I thought I was over my ex-husband, and he just announced his engagement, and all this stuff came up, So I talked to my sponsor, she said, you've got to forgive them, not just her, but him too. And I just fell off my chair. Forgive her? You've got to be kidding. Forgive? And so I talked to her afterwards. She said yes. And then she pointed me to the back of the book in Alcoholics Anonymous, the story Freedom from Bondage, where this woman talks about how she learned from a magazine article about forgiveness. And that, and so she's saying, well, if you'll pray for their happiness and their health and everything you want for yourself, and do it for a week, the forgiveness will come. I did it for 6 months, and I tend to overdo things, and it finally worked. To praying for them, and so, that in doing my own inventory, I had to learn how to take responsibility. So I had to learn to play the hand that I was dealt. It's so easy for me to blame my father and to blame other people in my life, for my misfortune. But that gets me nowhere. I have to take responsibility for my part. My parents loved me. They weren't bad parents. They were sick, as we know, as ACAs, we know that. My father took us skiing. He did a lot of stuff with us, took us on vacations, did a lot of stuff with us. He didn't abandon us in any way whatsoever. Matter of fact, he's probably too present, but very, very controlling. But that's the way he was, and he couldn't help it. He couldn't help it. And he and I talked about it some a little bit, and I tried to show him some videos. Every time I show him a video, though, he'd fall asleep. So, but after my mother died, he remarried, and the woman that he married had children as well. He took one look at their kids and decided his kids were pretty good. He started to appreciate us more. But also, I got to in the last couple of years of my mother's life, I talked to her 2 or 3 times a week, and she would tell me her dreams, and she'd had some experience with Jungian dreams and so forth, and I had many years of Jungian analysis, and so she'd tell me her dreams, and we would sort of analyze them together. It was fascinating, and so I really treasure that, that we had that. And it's something that I really looked forward to and missed, after she died. My brothers and I sort of, look at the Admiral and, and we laugh because he had a sense of humor, and he could, and he was great at telling stories and very charming, very handsome man. And so a lot of things we remembered about him were the good things about him that he did. But he was very, very controlling. I remember sitting on a beach with my cousin, whose father was my father's younger brother, and telling him about this stuff when I first learned it back in the mid-'80s. We were sitting on a beach in Massachusetts. And this guy was older than I am, and he was a practicing lawyer. And he was just listening to me like this, because he was identifying left, right, and center, with his controlling father, who was, if not more so than my father. And so it's amazing what this disease does. But once we start learning about it, then healing is possible. So the recovery from alcoholism, we're never cured. I'm still a rescuer. I'm still a codependent. I've not been cured, but I've experienced a great deal of healing. And I think that that's what recovery is about. It's about healing. And I think that's what I'd like to leave you with, is that we get together and we share our experience, strength, and hope. And we call each other and we help each other. And in the process, we heal. We get to find out who we are. I now know who I am. And I kind of like myself, Whereas before, I wanted you to love me, so I felt okay about myself. And I didn't have anything to give you in the process. So there's a great deal of healing in recovery. And it's really, really helped me in my recovery from alcoholism to also look at this aspect of, because I was codependent long before I was chemically dependent. And I think I became chemically dependent, seeking relief from the horrors of codependency. So we grow up, we don't get our needs met. That's traumatizing. And I think we're just beginning to realize this on a clinical level, is that not getting our needs met in our families of origin, that's traumatizing. So, and trauma always manifests itself in shame. It's what Bradshaw calls toxic shame, right? And toxic shame, there's that perfectionism. It's characterized by that perfectionism. Whereas healthy shame, which is another word for humility, is that it's okay for me to make a mistake, right? It's okay for me to be human, right? And that's huge for me, because I always thought I had to be perfect in order to be appreciated. And I always failed because of my learning disabilities. So we go from, and oftentimes we addicts, alcoholics, and codependents, get humiliated. Well, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. In that inability to take responsibility, we move from humiliation to humility. And that's a 180 in attitude. And that, for my money, is the spiritual awakening. Is moving from that humiliation to humility. Come from the same root, opposite meanings. Very opposite meanings. So we go from trying to be perfect to accepting ourselves and loving ourselves for who we really are. Thanks for letting me share.